my honor to give the floor now to the Congressman Scott Peters from the U.S. House of Representatives. Please.
Thank you very much, and good morning. It falls to me to follow the world's political climate leader and explain Washington, D.C. Let me talk a little bit about what the challenges are and then and maybe where there's some hope. But let's start with Donald Trump, who campaigned for president in 2016 using coal miners as his Exhibit A against government regulation, and he's remained committed to unwinding all of the progress on climate achieved under President Obama. That list is long, but let me remind you of a few. Most significant, he announced his intention for the United States to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. He appointed an oil and gas industry advocate, Scott Pruitt, to be the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. He tried to revoke rules that limit the emission of methane gas, although fortunately, at least for the time being, those have been stalled by the courts and by Congress. He's moved to revoke the Clean Power Plan, which was expected to cut CO2 emissions by 32% by 2030. Citing resiliency, the Department of Energy has proposed rules that would require large fuel supplies to be kept on site at power plants, which favors the use of coal and nuclear over renewables and even natural gas. The Environmental Protection Agency announced it would review, I think as the governor mentioned, recently adopted standards for automobile fuel economy. We expect those standards will be rolled back. More federally owned lands will be made available for fossil fuel extraction, and restrictions on offshore oil drilling will be loosened. And finally, this October, the EPA announced its 4-year strategic plan and omitted the phrase climate change altogether. Climate action used to be bipartisan. In his 2008 campaign for president, Republican Senator John McCain, who gains respect every day, ran advertisements in which he sounded the alarm on global warming, and he claimed that his credentials were stronger than those of his opponent, Barack Obama. Soon after that election, however, came a change through a well-funded campaign by many conservative groups who waged spent multi-million dollars to cast doubt on climate science and to intimidate Republican candidates from supporting climate action on television, in social media, and through political events. In 2008, anti-climate change groups began asking Republicans to sign a no climate tax pledge. In 2009, cap-and-trade legislation died in Congress, and the climate denial lobby went after Democrats who had voted for cap-and-trade, and then they took on Republicans who were sympathetic to green energy and climate action. Now, even after this long and well-funded disinformation campaign, and I think as someone alluded, Republican voters are not necessarily climate deniers. In a study conducted by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, about 70% of Republicans think that the climate is changing, and 53% think it's caused by human activity. But it's different for Republican candidates for office. And I address this more extensively in my written comments. But according to Republican strategist Whit Ayers, the entire climate change debate has now become caught up in the broader polarization of American politics. A denial of the human contribution to climate change has become yet another litmus test issue that determines whether you're a, quote, good Republican. Now, the good news is Washington Republicans, and this is just in the last few years, are no longer denying that the climate is changing, okay? Water is rising from the ground in Florida. Hurricane after hurricane is bashing Texas and the deep Republican South. And when Miami streets are wet on sunny days, and when you have 500-year storms happening every 3 years, people take notice. As of October 2017, 60 members of the House of Representatives, including me, have joined the Climate Solutions Caucus with an equal number of Democrats and Republicans to educate members on economically viable options to reduce climate risk and to explore bipartisan policy options that address the impacts, causes, and challenges of our changing climate. The Department of Defense continues to warn that climate can be a driver of instability. In the 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review, the department identified climate change as a significant security risk, quote, aggravating stressors abroad such as poverty, environmental degradation, political instability, and social tensions, conditions that can enable terrorist activities and other forms of violence. That's why this year's defense spending bill, adopted by a vote of 344 to 81, in that bill, the House of Representatives declared that climate change is a direct threat to national security. Last month, even Energy Secretary Rick Perry, who most of you know is from Texas, oil producer, testified to my energy subcommittee, and he agreed that the climate is changing and warming. This all gives us some hope, at least on the adaptation front. If we all agree that seas are rising, temperatures are warming, storms are more frequent and violent, and fires are more often and brutal, we can at least agree on a common set of facts that can help us prepare. We may consider new building standards that better defend against flood or fire, or zoning laws that will keep buildings from expanding flood zones. Our Navy can adjust its strategy to reflect melting ice. We can reform government flood and fire insurance programs to incentivize investments in resiliency and to discourage bad decision-making. And it is great that the undeniable fact of climate change is no longer denied, but even as Secretary Perry acknowledged climate change, he asserted that there was insufficient evidence to support the case that humans were the cause of climate change. The refusal by Secretary Perry, the Trump administration, and the vast majority of elected Republicans to acknowledge the basic scientific consensus that this change is human-driven remains the main obstacle to the critical steps we need to take now. So what are the voices? What are the voices that can move America to act on climate? Not just to gird ourselves as the planet dies, but to move us to save the planet. Who are those trusted voices that can turn the American public and our government to action? First, I want to say still it's scientists, and I think as Professor Foreman noted yesterday, Guarini noted, it's also doctors. Americans rely on science every day, whether they're following a medication, taking a medication prescribed by a doctor, or they're following a recipe for baking a cake. They believe in science. It must be discouraging for climate scientists to encounter the current irrationality, but rigorous climate science is still the most important input for the public and policymakers. Second, our state and local governments. Most of our states, many of our states, cities, counties, and ports, through their own sustainable energy, transportation, and planning policies, continue to demonstrate to Washington, D.C. that the choice between a prosperous economy and a healthy environment is a false choice. More likely, we can't have one without the other, and Exhibit A for that is California and Governor Brown. I want you to be aware of the third voice, the United States military. The Department of Defense is one of the largest fossil fuel users on Earth. But if you think about it, the United States Navy has always been the main innovator in energy, from sails to coal, from coal to oil, to nuclear, and now to alternative energy. In 2009, Navy Secretary Ray Mabus set a goal that by 2020, 50% of Navy consumption would come from alternative sources, and 50% of Navy and Marine Corps installations would be net zero. Since then, most people don't know that the Navy acts like California within the federal government in this way. The Navy has launched the Great Green Fleet. They launched that in my district in Coronado, powered in part by advanced biofuels, purchased at a competitive price even when oil prices were low. They've secured contracts for 1.1 gigawatts of renewable energy, and in partnership with the state of California, the Navy acquired 400 electric vehicles for its bases in California. Even changing to LED light bulbs is saving the Navy 20,000 gallons of fuel per year in its destroyers with longer lives, better light, and reduced maintenance costs. Why is that important? For this group, it's important because even in the craziness of Washington, D.C., a very respected institution, the military, is making the business case for transforming their energy from fossil fuels to renewables, just on the business case, not because they're tree huggers. Fourth, American business. Business is not waiting for Congress to say it's okay to compete in the renewable economy. Most businesses urge President Trump to stay in the Paris Agreement. And now that China has called for 1 out of every 5 cars sold there to run on alternative fuel within 8 years, every worldwide automaker will have to compete in that space. American politicians will see it's not just Tesla, but all U.S. car makers and their voting employees who are part of this climate revolution. I want to also note that shareholders in American companies are themselves demanding climate responsiveness. This May, ExxonMobil shareholders, with a vote of 62% of its shares, instructed the company to analyze and report on how the company would respond to global efforts to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius target. And the 2 largest shareholders in ExxonMobil are BlackRock and Vanguard, major Wall Street investment firms not known for being left-wing activists. Fifth, respected Republicans who are not in office are important advocates for climate action. This year, the Climate Leadership Council called for a tax on carbon, labeling it the conservative case for carbon dividends. I've brought a couple of the pamphlets with you if you want to take a look at them. The plan would oppose a gradually increasing tax on carbon, fully refunded to American taxpayers, combined with a repeal of regulations like the Clean Power Plan that would be redundant and less efficient at encouraging renewables than the carbon tax itself. Now, the idea itself is not novel, but the identity of its authors is novel. The council is led by James Baker, George Shultz, Henry Paulson, Martin Feldstein, all former members of the Reagan and Bush administrations, and respected conservative economists and businessmen. And finally, the church. The church can show the moral imperative of action on climate. I think that's been a recurrent theme through the discussions I've heard. This is not just about science, it's not just about data and measurements. It is a moral issue. And the Vatican's leadership is critical as we try to change not just the minds, but the hearts of Americans. It's more significant to it's even more significant as we try to influence the United States Congress, and here's why. According to the Pew Research Center, while the number of adults in the U.S. who describe themselves as Christian has been declining, the United States Congress is as Christian today as it was in the early 1960s. 91% of the Congress identifies as Christian, and 1/3 of the Christians in Congress identify as Catholic. And while the number of Christians in Congress has been virtually unchanged in the past 50 years, the number of Catholics in Congress has increased dramatically from 19 to 31%. So nearly 1/3 of Congress has a direct connection to this church, which is one reason why Pope Francis's commitment to making environmental stewardship a priority of his papacy has such potential to affect American climate policy. Something else is happening too. Evangelical Christians, who typically align with conservative Republicans, are weighing in on the need for climate action. And you're going to hear from Pastor Mitch in a couple minutes, who spends a lot of his time in Congress praying with and praying for my colleagues. Like this Pope, who is named for the saint from Assisi, who considered all living things his brothers and sisters, many leading evangelical Christians are taking up the cause of climate because they too believe we have a moral imperative to save the planet given to us by God. So I want to thank the Vatican and Pope Francis for your moral clarity and commitment to climate action, and for including me in this event. I'm very honored to have been selected to represent the United States Congress here today, and it's my hope and prayer that we can move that institution, which is a relevant institution and the most backward institution today, not by the views of its individual members, but by its collective action. We're the most backwards institution on climate, to one that can be a leader and one that can be pragmatic. And thank you very much.